The dining room smelled of roasted turkey, expensive pine candles, and decades of unspoken resentment. It was the annual year-end family dinner at my parents' suburban house in Missoula, Montana. Outside, the snow was falling thick and heavy, blanketing the streets in a quiet white. Inside, the noise was suffocating. My mother, Patricia, was holding court, loudly bragging to our extended relatives about her latest kitchen renovations. My father, Robert, was pouring his third glass of scotch, nodding along to whatever she said. And then there was Caleb, my younger brother, the golden boy. Sitting next to me was my daughter, Zoe. She is 8 years old, quiet, and possesses a kindness that this family never deserved to witness. She hadn't touched much of her food. She just sat there, her small hands resting in her lap, trying to make herself invisible. She knew, even at her age, that she was merely a guest in this house, not family. I was taking a sip of my water when it happened. Caleb leaned back in his chair, picking his teeth. He had just finished gnawing on a large prime rib bone. He looked across the table at Zoe, his eyes narrowing with a familiar, cruel amusement. He smirked, the kind of arrogant smile of a man who has never had to pay for his own mistakes. "You know," Caleb said, his voice slicing through the chatter of the room, "you really should eat up. Costs a lot of money to feed you. But then again, you're just a leech, like father, like daughter." Before I could even process the words, Caleb casually tossed the chewed, greasy bone across the table. It landed squarely on Zoe's plate with a sickening clatter, splattering drops of leftover gravy onto her pristine white holiday dress. The room went dead silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. For 3 seconds, the only sound was the crackling of the fireplace. I waited for my father to reprimand him. I waited for my mother to gasp in horror and rush to apologize to her granddaughter. Instead, Patricia let out a short, breathy chuckle. Then Robert snickered. Within seconds, the two of them were laughing. Not a polite, awkward laugh, but a genuine belly-deep laugh at the expense of an 8-year-old girl. They found it hilarious. They found the humiliation of my daughter entertaining. I looked at Zoe. Her bottom lip was trembling. A single tear rolled down her cheek, cutting a path through the faint splatter of grease on her face. She looked up at me, her eyes pleading for a reason why her own grandparents hated her so much. I didn't yell. I didn't slam my fists on the table. My heart rate didn't even spike. Instead, something inside my chest simply stopped. The frayed, worn-out rope that had tied me to these people for 35 years finally snapped. As a forensic accountant, I deal in facts, ledgers, and cold, hard data. I spend my days dismantling corporate frauds, tracing hidden assets, and staring down executives who think they can outsmart the system. I have trained my mind to remove emotion from the equation. And in that moment, sitting at that dining table, my family became nothing more than a bad investment. A liability that needed to be liquidated. I slowly wiped my mouth with a napkin and placed it neatly next to my plate. I stood up. The scraping of my chair against the hardwood floor cut through their laughter. I looked directly at Caleb, then at my parents. My voice was completely steady, devoid of any warmth or anger. "Everyone will get exactly what they deserve," I said. I didn't wait for a response. I reached down, took Zoe's small, trembling hand in mine, and walked out of the dining room. I grabbed our coats from the hallway rack. I didn't look back as we walked out the front door, pulling it shut behind us with a solid, final click. The cold Missoula air hit my face, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely awake. The walk to the car felt like stepping onto another planet. The crunch of the snow beneath my boots was the only sound in the freezing night. I opened the passenger door for Zoe, helping her into her seat and buckling her in. I took an extra second to pull my handkerchief from my pocket and gently wipe the stray drops of gravy from her cheek. She didn't say a word, just sniffled quietly, her small hands gripping the edge of her seatbelt. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. I stopped. I crouched down so I was eye level with her. You have absolutely nothing to be sorry for, Zoe. Do you understand me? Nothing. They are the ones who are broken, not you. I closed her door, walked around to the driver's side, and got in. I started the engine, cranking the heater up as high as it would go. The dashboard lights cast a faint orange glow in the dark cabin. As I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving the large, heavily decorated suburban house behind in the rearview mirror, my mind began to work with a frightening clarity. Driving through the snow-covered streets of Missoula, I began to audit my own life. I am a senior forensic accountant for a top-tier firm. Corporations pay me hundreds of dollars an hour to protect their assets, to find the leaks in their financial systems, and to ruthlessly eliminate them. I am the guy who catches the million-dollar discrepancies. Yet, for the last 10 years, I had been completely blind to the massive parasitic drain in my own personal ledger. My family. I thought about the $10,000 I had transferred to Caleb just 3 months ago. He said it was for his final year of college tuition. He had cried on the phone, claiming he would be kicked out if he didn't pay. I thought about the monthly auto transfers I had set up to cover my parents' property taxes and utility bills, because Robert had temporarily lost his managerial job 3 years ago and never bothered to find another one. I had funded their lifestyle. I had bought the food on that table. I had paid for the heating in that house. I was the bank. And in return, they treated me like a walking ATM and my daughter like a stray dog begging for scraps. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, the leather creaking under my hands. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. I had convinced myself that I was being the good son, the responsible older brother. I had bought into the toxic narrative that family is everything, even when that family is bleeding you dry. I had enabled their narcissism. I had given Caleb the financial safety net to become an entitled, arrogant man who thought it was funny to throw garbage at a child. I glanced at Zoe in the rearview mirror. She was staring out the window at the passing streetlights, holding onto the sleeves of her coat. My job was to protect her, and I had failed by forcing her to seek the approval of people who were incapable of love. The snow was coming down harder now, the windshield wipers rhythmic and steady. I didn't want to go back to our empty apartment. The silence there would be too loud for Zoe tonight. She needed warmth. She needed to know that not all adults were monsters. I flicked the turn signal and changed direction, heading toward the east side of town. There was only one person in this entire bloodline who possessed an ounce of sanity. My Aunt Sophia. She was my father's older sister, but they couldn't have been more different. Sophia was a retired high school teacher, widowed, living a quiet life in a small bungalow. She never asked me for a dime. She never played the family guilt trip games. As I pulled into Sophia's snow-covered driveway, I knew that tonight was the dividing line of my life. The man who drove to that dinner party was a useful idiot. The man who was parking the car right now was a professional auditor. And my family's accounts were officially under review. The porch light of Aunt Sophia's bungalow was a warm, yellow beacon in the freezing night. I carried Zoe up the wooden steps, her head resting heavily on my shoulder. Before I could even knock, the door swung open. Sophia stood there in her thick woolen cardigan, her sharp, perceptive eyes taking in the scene instantly. She didn't ask why we were there at 9 o'clock on the night of the family dinner. She just stepped aside and ushered us into the warmth. The house smelled of cinnamon, old books, and safety. "Bring her to the guest room," Sophia said softly, her voice a soothing contrast to the harshness we had just left behind. I laid Zoe down on the bed, pulling the thick quilt up to her chin. She was already half asleep, exhausted by the emotional toll of the evening. I sat on the edge of the mattress, brushing her hair back until her breathing leveled out into a deep, steady rhythm. When I finally walked out into the kitchen, Sophia had 2 mugs of steaming peppermint tea waiting on the wooden table. I sat down, wrapping my cold hands around the ceramic mug. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway was the only sound. "They laughed," I said finally, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. "Caleb called her a leech. He threw a chewed-up rib bone onto her plate. And Patricia and Robert, they just laughed. Sophia closed her eyes, letting out a long, slow exhale. She didn't look shocked. She just looked incredibly sad. I have paid for everything, I continued, the words spilling out like a confession. I paid $10,000 for Caleb's tuition this semester. I cover their property taxes. I pay for the very groceries they put on that table. I thought if I just took care of them, they would eventually accept us. Accept her. Sophia reached across the table and placed her warm, weathered hand over mine. Arthur, look at me. I looked up. Her eyes were fiercely clear. You are a brilliant man when it comes to numbers, she said, her tone gentle but unyielding. But you are blind when it comes to them. You are their bank, Arthur. You always have been. They don't respect the bank. They just expect the bank to dispense cash when they push the buttons. Her words hit me like a physical blow. It was the brutal, unvarnished truth. You paid $10,000 for Caleb, and they give you a chewed bone in return, Sophia said, her voice hardening slightly. What has that money bought you? Nothing but disrespect. They view your generosity not as a gift, but as a tax you owe them for being the successful one. For being the one who got away. I stared into my tea. She was right. The psychology of it was textbook. It was pure narcissism. My parents had raised Caleb to believe he was entitled to the world, and they used my guilt, the guilt of the successful older sibling, to fund that illusion. They resented my independence, so they punished the most vulnerable part of me, my daughter. You don't owe them a single cent more, Sophia said softly. You have done enough. You have done more than enough. It is time to close the vault, Arthur. I sat back in my chair. The final remnants of the good son withered and died right there in Sophia's kitchen. The obligation, the guilt, the desperate need for parental approval. It all evaporated, leaving behind a cold, sharp vacuum. They are going to be furious, I said, stating a mere fact, not expressing fear. Let them be furious, Sophia replied, taking a sip of her tea. Their anger is not your emergency. Protect your daughter. Protect your peace. I nodded slowly. I finished my tea, stood up, and thanked her. As I walked down the hallway to the guest room, the transition was complete. The emotional fog had lifted. I wasn't an angry son seeking an apology anymore. I was a forensic accountant, and it was time to cut the funding to a fraudulent enterprise. The guest room was dark, illuminated only by the pale moonlight filtering through the frost-covered window. Zoe was fast asleep, her breathing deep and even. I sat in the armchair in the corner of the room, pulled out my smartphone, and turned the screen brightness all the way down. It was time to sever the financial umbilical cord. I opened my banking app. The interface glowed in the dark, laying out the precise architecture of my exploitation. First, I navigated to the joint credit card management page. I had issued 2 supplementary cards on my primary account. One for Patricia, for household emergencies, and one for Caleb, for gas and textbooks. I tapped on Caleb's card. The transaction history populated instantly. In the last 48 hours, there were charges at a premium liquor store, a high-end steakhouse, and a video game digital storefront. Not a single textbook. Not a drop of gas. I didn't feel angry. I just felt a clinical satisfaction in confirming my hypothesis. I tapped the toggle switch on the screen. The system prompted me, "Are you sure you want to lock this card?" I tapped yes. Next, I selected Patricia's card. Her recent history showed charges at a luxury home goods store and a boutique spa. I tapped the toggle switch. Locked. Then I moved to my checking account. I opened the Scheduled Transfers tab. There it was, the monthly recurring payment labeled Mom and Dad House Fund. It was scheduled to execute in exactly 3 days to cover their property tax and utility bills. I hit the delete icon. The recurring transfer vanished from the screen. Just like that, the faucet was turned off. In less than 3 minutes, I had wiped out their primary source of disposable income and their safety net. I closed the banking app and opened my messages. I navigated to the group chat titled Family. The last message in the chat was from Patricia earlier that afternoon, reminding me to pick up a bottle of expensive wine on my way to dinner. I typed out a single, precise sentence. I didn't use all caps. I didn't use exclamation points. I didn't offer explanations, ultimatums, or demands for apologies. An auditor doesn't argue with a fraudulent vendor. He simply terminates the contract. I typed, all financial support, including credit cards and scheduled transfers, has been permanently terminated, effective immediately. I hit send. The little green bubble popped onto the screen. It was done. I put my phone on silent, placed it face down on the nightstand, and leaned back in the armchair. I expected to feel a wave of anxiety, a conditioned panic about their impending reaction. But instead, a profound sense of silence washed over me. It was the quietness of a ledger finally balancing out to zero. I sat there in the dark, watching my daughter sleep, and for the first time in years, I felt like a father who was actually doing his job. I had built a fortress around us, and I had just pulled up the drawbridge. I knew what would happen next. They would try to storm the gates. They would use guilt, manipulation, and rage. But they had fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. They thought they were dealing with the boy who craved their love. They didn't realize they had just declared war on a man who dismantles lives for a living using nothing but spreadsheets and data trails. I closed my eyes and let the silence of the room embrace me. The first cut had been made. Tomorrow, the bleeding would start, and I was perfectly content to watch them bleed out. The next morning, the storm arrived exactly as forecasted. I woke up early, quietly making coffee in Sophia's kitchen while Zoe slept in. When I finally flipped my phone over, the screen lit up with a barrage of notifications. The lock screen was a solid wall of text messages, missed calls, and voicemails. I took a sip of my black coffee and sat at the dining table, opening the family group chat. I applied the gray rock method, a psychological tactic used against narcissists where you become as uninteresting, unresponsive, and emotionally vacant as a gray rock. I was merely an observer collecting data. Patricia had sent the first message at 1:14 in the morning, right after her spa card likely declined at some late-night online checkout. Arthur? Why is my card declining? Fix this right now. By 2:30, the tone had shifted from demanding to frantic. Are you serious? You're cutting off your own mother over a joke? Caleb was just playing around. You are ruining this family over nothing. Then came Robert's messages. My father, the enabler, always stepped in to play the heavy. Arthur, you are acting like a petulant child. Turn the transfers back on before you do irreparable damage to this family. We raised you better than this. Finally, Caleb. His messages were exactly what I expected. Pure, unadulterated entitlement. Bro, you can't just cut my card. I need that for school. You owe me that money you promised. Stop throwing a tantrum and unlock it. I didn't reply to a single one. I didn't try to explain that throwing a bone at a child wasn't a joke. I didn't point out that Caleb's school money was being spent on premium liquor. Engaging with them would give them the supply of drama they craved. Instead, I pressed the side buttons on my phone and took screenshots of every single message. I was building a paper trail. By 9 o'clock, when they realized I wasn't taking the bait, Patricia escalated. She took it to the public square. I opened the Facebook app. There it was, right at the top of my feed. A long, melodramatic status update from Patricia, strategically crafted to make her look like a martyr. It breaks my heart, the post began. When you give your entire life to raise your children, only for them to abandon you when they become successful. Some people let money change them. They forget the family that sacrificed everything for them. Praying for healing today. She didn't name me, but in our tight-knit Missoula community, everyone knew exactly who she was talking about. The comments were already rolling in from distant relatives and nosy neighbors. So sorry, Patricia. Kids today have no respect. Sending prayers. It was a classic Darvo maneuver. Deny the abuse, attack the victim, and reverse the roles of victim and offender. She was playing the wounded mother perfectly. I watched the likes climb. A younger version of me would have panicked. I would have drafted a frantic comment defending myself, or called her begging her to take it down. But the man sitting in Sophia's kitchen just took another sip of coffee. I took a screenshot of the Facebook post, capturing the timestamp and the comments. I saved it into a newly created folder on my phone. Let them talk. Let the neighbors whisper. Let them paint me as the villain. Their public smear campaign was nothing more than noise. They were firing blanks into the air, unaware that I was holding the launch codes to their entire financial existence. I closed the social media app, put my phone in my pocket, and went to wake up Zoe. I promised her pancakes, and I had a full day of work ahead. The noise of my family was safely locked behind a glass screen, and for the first time it couldn't touch us. By Monday morning, the Missoula winter had settled into a bitter, biting cold. I dropped Zoe off at her elementary school, making sure her scarf was wrapped tight, before driving downtown to the high-rise building that housed my accounting firm. The office was a sanctuary of logic. The hum of the servers, the quiet clicking of keyboards, the smell of fresh printer paper. It was an environment where emotions were irrelevant and only numbers mattered. I settled into my office, a corner suite with a glass wall overlooking the snow-dusted city. I had just opened my laptop to begin reviewing a client's tax audit when the heavy glass door swung open. It was David. David was a senior partner at the firm, a corporate lawyer, and one of the few people I considered a genuine friend. He was sharp, pragmatic, and didn't waste words. He walked in holding a manila folder, his expression unusually grim. "We have a problem," David said, closing the door behind him and ensuring the blinds were drawn. I leaned back in my chair. I didn't think the Peterson audit was due until Friday. "This isn't about Peterson," David said. He walked over to my desk and dropped the folder right on top of my keyboard. "This is about you." The firm's automated compliance system ran its quarterly background credit check on all senior staff this weekend. It threw a massive red flag on your file. I frowned. As a forensic accountant handling sensitive corporate funds, maintaining an impeccable personal credit score was a strict condition of my employment. A compromised financial background could disqualify me from my job. "That's impossible," I said, opening the folder. "I have zero debt outside of my mortgage, and everything is on autopay. My credit score is flawless." "It was," David corrected, pointing to the second page of the report. "Until 3 months ago." I pulled the page closer. My eyes scanned the data, translating the columns and codes with practiced ease. And then, my heart completely stopped. Right there, glaring at me in black ink, was an unsecured personal loan. The principal amount was $10,000. The date of origin was exactly 3 months ago, and the status was marked in bold red letters. "Overdue, default imminent." "A $10,000 loan?" I muttered, staring at the paper. "David, I never took out a loan. I make enough to cover my expenses 3 times over. Why would I take a high-interest personal loan?" "That's what I figured," David said, crossing his arms. "But it has your name on it. Your social security number, your date of birth. The bank is a mid-tier regional lender based out of Idaho. They approved it digitally, and the first 3 minimum payments were completely missed. The account is about to be sent to a collection agency. Arthur, this is identity theft." The air in the office suddenly felt very thin. Identity theft. My mind raced, trying to calculate the vector of the attack. Was it a data breach at a retailer? A skimmed card? I reviewed my mental security protocols. I was paranoid about my data. I shredded everything. I used complex, rotating passwords. And then, a cold, dark realization began to creep into the back of my mind. The amount, $10,000. 3 months ago, Caleb had called me, crying about his tuition. 3 months ago, I had wired him exactly $10,000 from my own savings. I looked up at David. "Do we have the original application documents from the lender?" "I pulled the digital copies through our legal access portal," David said, tapping a second stack of paper in the folder. "It's all there." the application, the approval, and the electronic signature logs. I didn't say another word. I pulled the application file toward me. I wasn't looking at it as a victim anymore. The shock was gone, instantly replaced by the icy, calculating focus of a forensic investigator. Someone had breached my perimeter, and I was about to find out exactly who it was. "Give me an hour, David," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dead calm. David nodded, understanding the shift in my demeanor. "Let me know who we are suing." He turned and walked out of the office. I was left alone with the documents. The hunt had begun. I locked my office door. I didn't want any interruptions. I spread the loan application documents across my wide mahogany desk, arranging them sequentially like pieces of a crime scene. To the untrained eye, the paperwork looked perfectly legitimate. It bore my full legal name, my correct social security number, and my previous home address. The loan had been processed entirely online through an automated underwriting system, a common practice for unsecured loans under $20,000. I skipped past the boilerplate terms and conditions and went straight for the digital footprint. In modern financial fraud, the smoking gun isn't a forged handwritten signature. It's the metadata. I pulled up the DocuSign certificate of completion. This is the digital ledger that records exactly when, where, and how a document was electronically signed. It logs the date, the exact second of execution, and most importantly, the IP address of the device used to sign it. I ran my finger down the page until I found the IP address logged at the moment of signature. I typed the string of numbers into an IP geolocation tool on my secure workstation. I hit enter. The screen blinked, querying the database. A map appeared on my monitor, dropping a red pin directly onto a residential neighborhood in Missoula. I zoomed in. The neighborhood was familiar. I zoomed in further, right down to the street level. The red pin was sitting directly on top of a specific suburban house. Patricia and Robert's house. I sat back in my leather chair, letting the silence of the office wash over me. I didn't gasp. I didn't cry. I just stared at the red pin on the screen. My own mother. Patricia had taken my social security number, the number she had memorized when I was a child, and used it to impersonate me. She had sat in her heavily decorated living room, opened her laptop, and forged a loan agreement to steal $10,000 in my name. And she had let it default, destroying my credit score and jeopardizing my career, without a second thought. But I needed to be absolutely certain. In forensic accounting, you don't build a case on a single IP address. IP addresses can be spoofed, or a device could have been hacked. I needed undeniable, overlapping proof. I looked at the exact timestamp of the DocuSign signature. It was executed on a Tuesday afternoon at 2:45 p.m., exactly 3 months ago. I opened my personal calendar archive on my phone. I scrolled back 3 months to that specific Tuesday. At 2:45 p.m., I was in a secure, windowless conference room in Denver, Colorado, conducting a physical audit for a client. My phone had been locked in a security locker, and I had been offline for 6 hours. I had flight records, hotel receipts, and the sworn testimony of 3 corporate executives who were in the room with me. My alibi was ironclad. I couldn't possibly have signed that document. Next, I looked at the email address used to register the loan. It was a generic Gmail account, a slight variation of my name that I had never used. I ran a quick background query on the email's recovery data. The secondary recovery email linked to that fake account was Patricia's personal email address, the one she used to send me grocery lists. She had left a digital trail so wide and clumsy it was almost insulting. She thought that because it was the internet it was untraceable. She didn't realize that in the digital age, every keystroke leaves a permanent scar. I carefully gathered the documents, placing them back into the manila folder. The narrative was now perfectly clear. My parents hadn't just been bleeding me dry with their daily expenses. When they needed a massive lump sum, they didn't even bother asking. They just stole my identity. The $10,000 I had willingly transferred to Caleb 3 months ago for tuition, that was my own money. But this was bank fraud. Federal offense. I picked up a black marker and wrote 2 words in thick, bold letters across the front of the manila folder. Project Parasite. The son they thought they could manipulate was dead. The auditor they had unwittingly unleashed was about to audit their entire lives into the ground. I spent the rest of that afternoon locked inside my office. The manila folder labeled Project Parasite sat in the center of my desk. To build an airtight case for federal wire fraud and identity theft, I needed more than just a forged signature and an IP address. I needed intent, and I needed to prove a pattern of deception. I began by diving into Caleb's financial history. 3 months ago, when he had begged me for $10,000 to cover his final semester of tuition, he had sent me an invoice from the university. At the time, I had glanced at it and wired the money. Now, looking at it through the lens of an auditor, the flaws were glaringly obvious. I pulled up the PDF of the invoice he had emailed me. I zoomed in on the university crest. There were faint pixelation artifacts around the logo, and the font used for the billing amount was Arial, while the rest of the document used Times New Roman. It was a poorly photoshopped forgery. I made a quick phone call to the university's registrar office, using my credentials as an accountant to verify enrollment for tax purposes. The clerk on the other end was helpful. She pulled up Caleb's file and informed me that my brother had actually dropped out of his business administration program a year and a half ago. He hadn't attended a single class in 18 months. I thanked the clerk, hung up the phone, and let out a dry, humorless laugh. They had been lying to me for over a year. My parents had known. They lived in the same town. They knew he wasn't in school. The $10,000 I had willingly sent wasn't for education. It was a shakedown. And when they realized how easily I handed over $10,000, Patricia decided to skip the middleman and just take another $10,000 directly from my credit profile using the fraudulent loan. The good son inside me, the part that always wanted to give them the benefit of the doubt, was completely dead and buried. There was no misunderstanding here. There was no desperate family emergency that forced my mother to make a bad decision. This was calculated, premeditated theft. I opened a new Word document and began drafting the timeline of events. I took the screenshots of Patricia's recent Facebook posts, where she was currently playing the victim of a greedy, ungrateful son, and added them to the appendix of the file. Every time she posted a dramatic status update about how I had abandoned the family, she was establishing a public record of her own malicious intent. She was trying to control the narrative in our small community of Missoula, completely unaware that I was building a federal case against her. I didn't feel a shred of guilt. The emotional manipulation that had controlled me for 35 years had completely evaporated. When you look at a spreadsheet, you don't feel sorry for a negative number. You just balance the book. My family was a massive deficit, and I was preparing to zero them out. I printed the forged tuition invoice, added it to the folder, and moved on to the next phase of the investigation: tracking the stolen money. The next morning, I arrived at the office before the sun was even up. I had a clear goal. I needed to track exactly where the $10,000 from the fraudulent loan had gone. In the world of finance, money never actually disappears. It simply changes form, leaving a digital breadcrumb trail along the way. I used our firm's secure portal to initiate a trace on the loan disbursement. The Idaho-based bank had wired the $10,000 into a newly created checking account. The account was in my name, but the routing information directed it to a completely different bank branch on the other side of Missoula. I contacted the fraud department of that receiving bank. I introduced myself, provided my social security number, and calmly explained that an account had been fraudulently opened in my name. I didn't ask for my money back. I asked for the transaction ledger. Because the account was legally in my name, they were obligated to provide me with the statements. 10 minutes later, the ledger arrived in my secure email inbox. I opened the document. The $10,000 had landed in the fake account on a Thursday. By Friday morning, the entire balance had been drained in 2 distinct transactions. The first transaction was a wire transfer for $7,500. The recipient was a local motorsports dealership on the highway just outside of town. The second transaction was a debit card purchase for $2,500. $500 at a high-end jewelry boutique in the downtown shopping district. I stared at the screen, my jaw tight. There was no medical emergency. There was no impending foreclosure that drove my mother to steal my identity. Patricia had forged my signature, ruined my credit, and committed a federal crime so that Caleb could buy a motorcycle, and she could buy herself expensive jewelry. The sheer audacity of it was almost impressive. They felt so incredibly entitled to my earnings that they didn't even bother to spend the stolen money on necessities. They spent it on luxury toys, fully expecting that, even if I found out, I would just absorb the blow. After all, that was my established pattern. I was Arthur, the reliable bank. I would get mad, I would yell, and then I would eventually forgive them and fix it. Not this time. I took the ledger, the routing numbers, and the dealership information, and added them to the manila folder. The dossier was now nearly 40 pages long. It contained IP address logs, forged tuition documents, fraudulent electronic signatures, and a clear, undeniable money trail proving exactly where the stolen funds had gone. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting. I picked up the folder and walked down the hall to David's office. I didn't knock. I pushed the door open and dropped the thick file onto his desk. "I found it," I said. David opened the folder. He spent the next 20 minutes reading through my findings in absolute silence. He traced the IP addresses, examined the forged invoice, and looked at the final ledger showing the motorcycle and jewelry purchases. When he finally looked up, his expression was a mix of professional awe and deep, personal disgust. "Arthur," David said, leaning back in his chair, "this isn't just a civil dispute. Your mother committed first-degree wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. And your brother is an accessory to the possession of stolen funds. If we hand this over to the Idaho Bank's legal team, she is going to face serious prison time." "I know," I said. My voice was perfectly flat. "Package it up. Send it to the bank's fraud division. Tell them we have the entire case wrapped up with a bow, and we are fully prepared to cooperate with law enforcement." David nodded slowly. "Consider it done." For the next week, I lived in a state of absolute hyper-focused calm. While David was coordinating with the fraud division of the Idaho Bank and the local authorities, I went about my daily life as if nothing had changed. My phone continued to receive angry text messages from my father, Robert. He demanded to know why the monthly property tax transfer hadn't gone through. He accused me of being petty and trying to punish them for a simple misunderstanding at the dinner table. I ignored every single message. Meanwhile, Patricia's social media campaign was reaching a fever pitch. She was posting daily updates about the pain of a mother's broken heart. She posted a picture of an old family album, writing a caption about how she missed the days when her son had a soul, before money made him cold and ruthless. My Aunt Sophia called me one evening, her voice laced with concern. "Arthur, people in town are talking. Patricia is telling everyone at the church group that you lost your mind and cut them off out of spite. Do you want me to say something to them?" "No, Aunt Sophia," I said, smiling as I watched Zoe color at the kitchen table. "Let her talk. Give a narcissist enough rope, and they will eventually hang themselves in front of an audience. Her public statements are only going to make the reality of her arrest much more entertaining." Behind the scenes, the trap was snapping shut. On Thursday afternoon, David called me into his office. He had a federal investigator from the bank on speakerphone. The investigator, a man named Agent Harris, was reviewing my 40-page dossier. "Mr. Larson," Agent Harris said, his voice crisp and professional over the speaker, "I have been working in financial crimes for 20 years, and I have never received a victim report this thorough. You have essentially done our entire job for us." "Just protecting my assets, Agent Harris," I replied. "We have verified the IP logs and obtained security footage from the jewelry store," Harris continued. "We have clear video of your mother, Patricia Larson, purchasing a diamond tennis bracelet using the debit card tied to the fraudulent account. We also have the dealership records showing the motorcycle was registered to your brother, Caleb Larson. The bank has officially frozen the outstanding loan balance and flagged the account." "What are the next steps?" David asked. "We are turning this over to the Missoula Economic Crimes Unit," Harris said. "Because the fraud crossed state lines electronically, it falls under federal jurisdiction, but the local police will execute the initial arrest warrants for identity theft and fraud. They are prepping the paperwork now." I looked out the window at the Missoula skyline. It was snowing again. "Agent Harris," I said slowly, "my family is currently under the impression that I am simply throwing a tantrum over a family argument. They don't know that I have discovered the loan. They think I am eventually going to cave and give them money." "And you want to catch them off guard?" Harris asked, catching my drift. "I want to orchestrate a controlled environment for the confrontation," I said. "If the police just show up at their house, my mother will have time to hide the jewelry or try to destroy her laptop. I want to draw them out. I want them to bring the stolen assets directly to me, in public." David raised an eyebrow, a slight grin forming on his face. "I can speak to the local detective handling the warrant," Harris said. "If you set up a meeting, they can arrange to have plainclothes officers present. But you have to ensure the suspects are there, and you cannot incite violence." "There will be no violence," I promised. "Just an audit." That Saturday, the contrast between my reality and my family's delusion was staggering. While Patricia was busy painting me as a monster to anyone in Missoula who would listen, I was spending my morning doing the one thing I had neglected for too long, being a present father. I took Zoe to a local dance studio. Aunt Sophia had suggested it, saying Zoe needed a safe space to express herself, away from the tension that had clouded our lives. We walked into a small boutique that sold dancewear. Zoe's eyes lit up as she looked at the rows of pink leotards and soft leather slippers. She tentatively reached out to touch a pair of pale pink ballet shoes. "Do you like those?" I asked, kneeling beside her. She nodded shyly, looking down at her boots. "But they are expensive, Dad. We don't have to get them." My heart broke a little at her words. At 8 years old, she had already internalized the anxiety of scarcity, all while my brother was riding around on a $7,000 motorcycle paid for with stolen money. "Zoe, look at me," I said, gently tilting her chin up. "You never have to worry about money. That is my job. If you want to dance, you are going to dance. We are getting the shoes." When we left the store with the ballet shoes and a new leotard, Zoe had a genuine, radiant smile on her face. It was the first time I had seen her look so carefree since the disastrous dinner party. Taking her to the dance studio, watching her awkwardly but happily try to follow the instructor's movements, solidified everything I was doing. I was excising a cancer from our lives so she could finally breathe. Later that evening, after Zoe was asleep in her new room, I sat down at my laptop. It was time to set the bait. I opened the family group chat. It had been completely silent for 3 days. They were playing the waiting game, expecting the silent treatment to break me down. I crafted my message with the precision of a psychological surgeon. I needed to sound just defeated enough to stroke their massive egos, but vague enough not to make any legal promises. I typed, "I have had time to think. This silence isn't helping anyone. We need to sit down and discuss the financial situation. I want to settle things properly. Meet me at the downtown espresso bar tomorrow at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I will bring my checkbook." I hit send. I watched the screen. Less than 2 minutes later, the read receipts appeared. They were awake, and they were watching their phones like hawks. 3 minutes later, Patricia replied, "It takes a big man to admit when he is wrong, Arthur. We are your family. We will be there. Please bring enough to cover the late fees on the property taxes you missed." Then Caleb chimed in. "'Bout time. Bro, make sure you bring enough to cover my textbook expenses too. See you tomorrow." I closed the laptop and took a deep breath. The arrogance was blinding. They had stolen $10,000, forged my signature, and nearly ruined my career, yet they still believed they had the upper hand. They honestly thought I was coming to the cafe to hand them a blank check and beg for their forgiveness. I picked up my phone and sent a single text message to David. "The bait is taken. 1 o'clock tomorrow. Downtown espresso bar." David replied instantly. The Missoula Economic Crimes Unit is confirmed. 2 plainclothes detectives will be having coffee at the corner table. See you tomorrow, Arthur. I set my phone on the charger and turned off the lights. The board was set. The pieces were in motion. Tomorrow, the Bank of Arthur was closing its doors permanently. Sunday morning arrived with a clear, bitterly cold sky. The snow had stopped falling, leaving downtown Missoula looking like a pristine, frozen postcard. I woke up feeling completely rested. There was no anxiety in my chest, no nervous fluttering in my stomach. I felt the exact same way I feel when I walk into a corporate boardroom to present a damning audit report to a corrupt board of directors. I was simply going to work. I arranged for Aunt Sophia to take Zoe to the local aquarium for the afternoon. I didn't want my daughter anywhere near the cafe when the reality of her grandparents' choices finally caught up with them. At 12:45, I walked into the downtown espresso bar. It was a modern, busy place with exposed brick walls, large glass windows, and a steady hum of conversation. I ordered a black Americano and took a seat at a large, wooden table near the center of the room. It was highly visible, offering no corners to hide in. I placed the thick manila folder labeled Project Parasite on the table, resting my hands neatly on top of it. I glanced toward the back of the cafe. Sitting at a small table near the restrooms were 2 men in heavy winter coats, quietly drinking coffee and looking at a laptop. They looked like typical remote workers, but I noticed the subtle earpieces and the deliberate way they positioned themselves to have a clear line of sight to the main entrance. The Missoula Economic Crimes detectives were in position. At exactly 1 o'clock, a shiny, black SUV pulled up to the curb outside the glass windows. It was the vehicle I had essentially paid for over the last 3 years. Patricia, Robert, and Caleb got out. They looked like royalty arriving to collect their taxes. Patricia was wearing an expensive faux fur coat, and I noticed a distinct sparkle on her wrist as she adjusted her gloves. The diamond tennis bracelet. She actually wore the stolen merchandise to the meeting. Caleb walked in first, his chest puffed out, holding a motorcycle helmet under his arm. He had ridden his new Ducati to the cafe and parked it down the street, likely wanting to show off. They walked over to my table. No one smiled. No one offered a greeting. They were playing the roles of the deeply offended victims, waiting for my apology. Robert pulled out a chair and sat heavily. You look tired, Arthur. This petty rebellion of yours has clearly taken a toll on you. Patricia sat next to him, crossing her arms and letting out a long, dramatic sigh. I hope you are ready to apologize to your brother. The things you have put this family through over the last 2 weeks are unforgivable. Caleb didn't sit. He leaned against the back of an empty chair, smirking down at me. Let's just cut to the chase, man. I have places to be. You said you brought your checkbook. I need $4,000 to cover the card you locked, plus my school fees. I didn't reach for my pocket. I didn't reach for a pen. I simply looked at the 3 of them, studying their faces. I wanted to remember this exact moment of their supreme, unearned confidence. I didn't bring my checkbook, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the noise of the cafe like a razor. Caleb's smirk faltered. Patricia uncrossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. What do you mean you didn't bring it? Your text message specifically said, I know what the message said, Patricia. I interrupted, dropping the title of mother. It was the only way to ensure you would all show up in one place. I slid the thick manila folder across the wooden table, stopping it right in front of her. I didn't bring a check, I said, leaning forward, my eyes locked onto hers. I brought an audit. Patricia stared at the manila folder as if it were a bomb. The arrogance on her face began to crack, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. Robert scoffed, reaching forward to grab the file. What nonsense is this, Arthur? Robert demanded. We are not playing your corporate games. If you aren't going to give us the money to fix the mess you made, we are leaving. Open it, I said, my tone flat, leaving absolutely no room for debate. Robert flipped the folder open. The first page was the bank summary of the overdue $10,000 loan. The large red letters reading default imminent glared up at them. A loan? Robert frowned, looking at Patricia. Did you ask him for a loan? I didn't ask for anything, I said calmly, taking a slow sip of my Americano. She didn't ask, Robert. She simply took it. Turn to page 3. Robert flipped the pages. There was the DocuSign signature certificate. 3 months ago, Patricia used my social security number, logged into an Idaho banking portal from the router inside your living room, and forged my electronic signature. I explained, speaking clearly enough for the plainclothes detectives in the back to hear every word. She committed identity theft and federal wire fraud to secure $10,000 in my name. Patricia's face drained of all color. The faux fur coat suddenly looked too heavy for her. Her hand instinctively shot up to cover her mouth, the diamonds on her stolen tennis bracelet catching the light of the cafe. That's a lie, Patricia stammered, her voice pitching up in panic. I don't know what you are talking about. You must have signed it and forgotten. You are trying to frame me. Page 12, I continued, ignoring her pathetic attempt at denial. The IP geolocation report. Page 15, my flight records and sworn affidavits proving I was in Colorado at the exact moment the document was signed from your IP address. Caleb stopped leaning against the chair. He looked at the paperwork, then at our mother. Mom? What is he talking about? It gets better, Caleb, I said, shifting my gaze to my brother. Turn to page 25. Robert, his hands now trembling slightly, turned the pages until he hit the bank ledger. I was curious why Patricia would risk federal prison for $10,000. I said, my voice echoing cold logic. There was no foreclosure. There were no medical bills. So I subpoenaed the routing numbers. The $10,000 was wired into a dummy account and immediately spent. $2,500 at a jewelry boutique downtown. I pointed directly at Patricia's wrist. A very nice tennis bracelet, Patricia. Robert slowly turned his head to look at his wife's wrist. He looked like a man waking up from a long, confusing dream. And the remaining $7,500, I said, looking right through Caleb, was wired to the Missoula Motorsports dealership to purchase a black Ducati motorcycle. The exact one you parked down the street 15 minutes ago. Caleb's jaw dropped. He stepped back from the table as if it were on fire. I didn't know. Mom gave me that money. She said she won it at the casino. Ignorance is not a valid legal defense for the possession of stolen assets. Caleb, I stated, reciting the law with chilling precision. The bank has already placed a lien on the motorcycle. It is evidence of wire fraud. The cafe around us seemed to vanish. The only thing left in the world was the suffocating reality of the folder on the table. The empire of lies my family had built over decades was collapsing in real time, crushed under the weight of undeniable, documented facts. Patricia began to hyperventilate. Her eyes darted wildly around the room. The trap had closed, and she was entirely out of moves. You are insane, Patricia hissed, her voice trembling as she tried to regain some semblance of control. She pushed the folder away from her as if distancing herself physically would alter the reality of the documents. You fabricated all of this. You are trying to ruin us because of a stupid joke at a dinner party. You are a monster, Arthur. I didn't blink. I leaned back in my chair, steepled my fingers, and delivered the final blow. I didn't fabricate anything, Patricia, I said softly. And I am not the one prosecuting you. I am simply the auditor. The entity prosecuting you is the Federal Fraud Division of the bank. Robert's head snapped up, his eyes wide with genuine terror. Prosecuting? Arthur, what have you done? You involved the police. I didn't involve them, I corrected. Patricia involved them the second she committed bank fraud across state lines. I simply handed them the completed investigation. The bank has already frozen the fraudulent account, and they have handed the jurisdiction over to the Missoula Economic Crimes Unit. The blood completely drained from Caleb's face. He looked at his motorcycle helmet, then at the door, clearly calculating if he could run. "You can't do this," Patricia suddenly shrieked. The elegant, martyred mother persona she had curated on Facebook shattered into a million pieces. She slammed her hands onto the table, rattling the coffee cups. "I am your mother. I gave you life. I raised you. You owe me everything you have. If I needed a loan, it was because you were too selfish to just give me the money." The cafe went quiet. Several patrons turned to stare at our table. There it was, the absolute core of her narcissism. Even when presented with 40 pages of evidence proving she had stolen my identity, she still believed she was entirely justified. She still believed I was the villain for catching her. "You don't own me," I said, my voice icy and final. "You never did. You used me. You used my credit, my income, and my guilt to fund a lifestyle you never earned. And when I stopped paying the ransom, you resorted to theft. Identity theft carries a mandatory minimum sentence. Wire fraud carries up to 15 years. You aren't going to spend your retirement in that suburban house, Patricia. You are going to spend it in a federal facility." That was the breaking point. Patricia deployed her ultimate weapon, the one that had worked on my father and me for my entire childhood. She deployed Darvo. She collapsed back into her chair, clutching her chest. She began to sob loud, gasping, theatrical sobs. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her makeup. "My heart," she wailed, leaning against Robert. "He is killing me, Robert. My own son is trying to send me to prison, and he is giving me a heart attack. Help me. Somebody help me." Robert stood up, his face red with a mixture of fear and misplaced rage. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "Look at what you are doing to your mother. You are a cold, heartless bastard. Call an ambulance." I didn't move. I didn't reach for my phone. I just looked at her, watching the performance. "Tears have no legal value, Patricia," I said loudly, cutting through her fake sobbing. "And faking a medical emergency isn't going to stop what is about to happen. You should look over your shoulder." Robert and Caleb turned around. Patricia's sobs hitched, and she opened one eye to look. Walking toward our table from the back of the cafe were the two men who had been working on their laptops. They had closed their computers. The taller man, Detective Miller, reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a leather badge case, letting it flip open to reveal a silver Missoula police shield. The performance was over. The finale had arrived. Detective Miller stopped at the edge of our table, flanked by his partner. He didn't look angry. He looked bored, like a man who had seen this exact scenario play out 100 times before. He looked down at Patricia, who was still clutching her chest, frozen mid-sob. "Patricia Larson?" Detective Miller asked, his voice a low, authoritative rumble. Patricia couldn't speak. She just stared at the silver badge, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "I am Detective Miller with the Missoula Economic Crimes Unit," he continued, pulling a folded piece of paper from his jacket. "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of identity theft, bank fraud, and federal wire fraud. Please stand up and place your hands behind your back." The cafe was dead silent. No one was drinking coffee. No one was typing. Everyone was watching. Robert stepped in front of his wife, raising his hands in a pathetic defensive gesture. "Now wait just a minute, officer. This is a huge misunderstanding. My son here is just upset about a family argument. We can sort this out privately. We will pay the bank back." "Sir, step aside," the second detective said, his tone hardening. "This is not a civil dispute. The bank is pressing criminal charges. If you interfere with the execution of this warrant, you will be arrested for obstruction." Robert wilted instantly. He stepped back, leaving Patricia entirely exposed. Patricia looked at me, her eyes wide, begging. The arrogance was gone. The manipulation was gone. She was finally terrified. "Arthur, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Tell them to stop. Tell them it was a mistake. I'll give the bracelet back. I'm your mother. Please." I looked at her, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no guilt, no victory, just the cold satisfaction of a balanced ledger. I told you, I said softly. Everyone will get exactly what they deserve. Detective Miller reached out, grasped Patricia by the arm, and pulled her to her feet. He smoothly spun her around, and the sharp, metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the quiet cafe. Patricia let out a genuine wail of despair as the steel locked around her wrists. Caleb, who had been standing frozen against the wall, suddenly bolted for the door. "Hey!" the second detective shouted. Caleb didn't get far. He pushed through the glass doors and immediately ran directly into two uniformed Missoula police officers who had been waiting outside on the sidewalk. They grabbed him by the jacket, slamming him against the brick wall of the building. "Caleb Larson?" one of the uniformed officers asked, patting him down. "We have an impound order for a Ducati motorcycle registered in your name, purchased with stolen funds. Hand over the keys." Through the glass windows of the cafe, I watched my brother, the golden boy who thought he was entitled to my money, pull the keys from his pocket with shaking hands and hand them to the police officer. Inside, Detective Miller was reading Patricia her Miranda rights. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Robert stood by the table, his face buried in his hands, quietly crying. The life he had coasted through, funded by my hard work and sustained by his wife's manipulations, was completely destroyed. I stood up from the table. I picked up my empty coffee cup and tossed it into the trash bin. I didn't say goodbye to my father. I didn't look back at my mother as she was escorted out the front door in handcuffs, past the staring crowds on the sidewalk. I pushed the glass doors open, breathing in the freezing, crisp Montana air. The police cruisers were flashing their red and blue lights, illuminating the snowbanks. I zipped up my coat, turned left, and walked away down the street. The audit was officially closed. The fallout was swift, brutal, and entirely public. In a small town like Missoula, news of a federal arrest travels faster than a wildfire. By Monday morning, Patricia's mugshot was printed in the local county blotter. The same neighbors who had been offering her sympathy on Facebook just 48 hours ago were now fiercely gossiping about the scandal. The narrative had violently flipped. She wasn't the martyred mother of an ungrateful son. She was a criminal who had stolen her own child's identity to buy jewelry. I sat in my office with David, reviewing the preliminary legal documents from the district attorney. "They denied her bail," David said, sliding a piece of paper across my desk. "Because it involves federal bank fraud and she poses a flight risk, she is going to sit in county lockup until the arraignment. The Idaho Bank is pushing for the maximum penalty to set a precedent." "What about Robert and Caleb?" I asked, looking over the filing. "Robert wasn't formally charged, as there is no proof he knew about the forged signature at the time it happened," David explained. "But he is ruined financially. The bank has initiated foreclosure proceedings on their suburban house. Without your monthly transfers to cover the property taxes and mortgage, they defaulted immediately. The house will be auctioned by spring." I nodded slowly. The castle built on my dime was finally crumbling. "And Caleb?" I asked. "The police impounded the motorcycle," David said, smiling slightly. "Because Caleb technically accepted stolen funds, the DA offered him a plea deal. He avoids jail time, but he gets 5 years of strict probation, and he has to pay restitution for the depreciation of the motorcycle. I heard he just got a job working the night shift at a local diner to pay for a public defender." The golden boy, reduced to serving burgers at 2 a.m. to pay off a felony debt. It was poetic justice. Later that afternoon, I drove to the county courthouse. I wasn't there to visit Patricia. I was there to file a permanent restraining order. I stood before the judge, a stern-looking woman who had already reviewed the fraud case. I presented the threatening text messages from Robert, the harassing Facebook posts from Patricia, and the full timeline of their financial abuse. "Given the severity of the identity theft and the ongoing harassment, Mr. Larson," the judge said, stamping the paperwork, "I am granting a permanent order of protection. Robert, Patricia, and Caleb Larson are legally forbidden from contacting you or your daughter, Zoe, by any means. They cannot approach your home, your workplace, or her school. If they violate this, they will be arrested immediately. I took the stamped document. Felt heavier than it looked. It was a physical shield, forged from the law, guaranteeing that my family could never touch us again. I walked out of the courthouse and looked up at the winter sky. For 35 years, I had carried the suffocating weight of their expectations. I had let them convince me that I was responsible for their happiness, their debts, and their failures. I had let them treat my daughter like an outsider to appease their fragile egos. But as I stood on the courthouse steps, holding the restraining order, I realized the weight was entirely gone. I didn't feel angry anymore. I didn't feel sad. I felt incredibly, profoundly light. I pulled my phone from my pocket, opened my contacts list, and executed the final step of the procedure. I selected Robert's number and hit block. I selected Caleb's number and hit block. I permanently deleted the family group chat. I scrubbed them from my digital life, erasing them as easily as deleting a corrupted file from a hard drive. They were gone. The parasites had been removed. It was time to heal the host. 2 months later, the remnants of my former family were completely dismantled. I drove past my parents' old neighborhood one last time on my way to a client meeting. The large suburban house, the one Patricia used to constantly brag about, looked hollow. The lawn was covered in dirty, unplowed snow. Planted firmly in the front yard was a bright red bank foreclosure sign. Robert had moved into a cheap, cramped apartment on the outskirts of town, entirely reliant on his meager Social Security checks. Patricia had taken a plea deal to avoid federal trial. She was sentenced to 4 years in a minimum security federal facility, plus mandated restitution to the bank. The diamond tennis bracelet had been seized and liquidated. Her Facebook account had gone completely dark. The woman who thrived on public perception was now wearing a state-issued jumpsuit, completely stripped of her audience. And Caleb, as I had predicted, couldn't handle the pressure of actual, grueling labor. Aunt Sophia told me he had been fired from the diner for showing up late and arguing with the manager. He was now living on Robert's couch, a 30-something college dropout with a felony probation record and zero prospects. They had destroyed themselves. I didn't lift a finger to ruin them. I simply stopped standing in the way of their own catastrophic choices. I let the consequences of their actions hit them at full velocity. My own life, however, was accelerating in the opposite direction. I was sitting in my office when the managing partner of the accounting firm walked in. He didn't have a folder this time. He had a smile and a firm handshake. "Arthur," he said, taking a seat across from me. "The board has been reviewing the quarterly metrics. Your division's performance has been flawless. Furthermore, the way you handled the identity theft issue, with absolute discretion, legal precision, and zero disruption to the firm, was highly impressive. It showed incredible crisis management." I leaned forward. "Thank you, sir. We are expanding our forensic operations," he continued. "We want you to step up as the Regional Director of Forensic Auditing for the entire Northwest Division. It comes with a massive increase in base salary, full equity options, and a corner penthouse office on the top floor." I took a deep breath. A year ago, an increase in salary would have just meant more money for Caleb to waste, or more expensive renovations for Patricia's kitchen. Now, it meant absolute security for Zoe. "I accept," I said, shaking his hand. That evening, I went back to my apartment and immediately started packing boxes. We were not staying in this cramped 2-bedroom unit anymore. We were upgrading. I had found a beautiful, modern penthouse apartment right in the heart of downtown Missoula. It had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the mountains, a state-of-the-art security system, and most importantly, a massive secondary bedroom with enough space for a small dance floor. When I told Zoe the news, she didn't quite believe it at first. "We are moving?" she asked, her eyes wide as I taped up a cardboard box. "To a bigger house? To a palace, sweetie?" I smiled, ruffling her hair. And nobody is ever going to come into our palace who doesn't treat you like a princess. I promise you that. She threw her arms around my neck, hugging me tightly. The faint, lingering anxiety that used to permanently reside in her eyes was completely gone. She was thriving in school. She was making friends in her ballet class, and she knew with absolute certainty that her father would protect her against anything, even his own blood. Moving day arrived with the bright, crisp promise of early spring. The snow in Missoula was finally beginning to melt, giving way to patches of green grass. The moving company handled the heavy lifting, allowing Zoe and me to simply walk into our new penthouse apartment and take it all in. The space was breathtaking. The sunlight poured through the massive glass windows, illuminating the polished hardwood floors. I walked out onto the private balcony, overlooking the city below. The air smelled fresh, clean, and completely devoid of the toxic history I had left behind. Aunt Sophia arrived an hour later, carrying a large housewarming gift, a beautiful, leafy monstera plant in a ceramic pot. "To new beginnings," Sophia said, setting the plant down in the sunlit living room and pulling me into a warm hug. "Arthur, the place is stunning." "It's safe," I corrected her softly, looking over at Zoe, who was already running around her new room, spinning in her socks on the hardwood floor. "That's the best part. It's completely safe." Sophia walked out onto the balcony with me, holding a cup of coffee I had just brewed. We looked out over the city in comfortable silence for a moment. "You did the right thing, Arthur," Sophia said suddenly, her voice quiet but firm. "I know society tells us that family is unconditional, but abuse should never be unconditional. You cut off a dying branch to save the tree." "I used to feel guilty," I admitted, leaning against the glass railing. "Whenever I set a boundary, they would make me feel like I was committing a crime. But when I finally saw the hard data, the IP address, the stolen funds, the lies, it was like flipping a switch. You can't argue with a ledger. And they were bankrupting my soul." Sophia smiled, a sad but proud smile. "Your father called me last week. He tried to get me to talk to you, to convince you to drop the restraining order." I stiffened slightly. "What did you tell him?" "I told him to lose my number," Sophia said with a fierce, protective glint in her eye. "I told him that he chose his path when he sat at that dinner table and laughed at his granddaughter. And I chose my path today. I choose my nephew. I choose Zoe." A wave of profound gratitude washed over me. I wasn't entirely without family. I just had to ruthlessly curate it. I had to surround myself with people who respected my boundaries, who loved my daughter, and who added value to my life instead of draining it. "Thank you, Aunt Sophia," I said. "Don't thank me," she replied, patting my arm. "You did the hard work. You built this fortress. Now you just get to enjoy the view." As she walked back inside to help Zoe unpack her books, I stayed on the balcony for a moment longer. I thought back to the night of the dinner party. I thought about the chewed bone hitting Zoe's plate and the cruel laughter that followed. They thought they were humiliating a child to assert their dominance. They had no idea they were initiating their own financial and social execution. They had awoken a forensic accountant, and I had simply audited them out of existence. I took a deep breath of the mountain air. The ledger was balanced. The accounts were closed. And the rest of my life was officially ready to begin. The first few weeks in the penthouse were a revelation. The absence of chaos is a strange thing to adjust to when you have lived your entire life anticipating the next crisis. Every time my phone buzzed, I didn't instinctively tense up, expecting a demanding text from my mother or a guilt trip from my father. My phone only rang with calls from colleagues, friends, and clients who respected my time. My inbox was filled with corporate audits, not fabricated tuition bills. I had hired a private contractor to install a small, professional-grade ballet bar and a mirrored wall in the corner of Zoe's expansive new bedroom. The afternoon it was finished, I picked her up from school and brought her straight to the room. When she saw it, she dropped her backpack. She walked over to the mirror, gently placing her hand on the wooden bar. She looked at me through the reflection, her eyes wide with absolute wonder. "Is this really for me?" she asked, her voice hushed. "It's all yours, Zoe," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "You can practice whenever you want. Nobody is ever going to tell you that you are a burden in this house. You are the reason this house exists." She put on her pink ballet shoes, the ones we had bought the day I set the trap for Patricia. She began to do her warm-up stretches, her movements clumsy but filled with a beautiful, unburdened joy. I stood there watching her, feeling a fierce, protective pride swelling in my chest. This was the return on my investment. This was what the money was actually for. Not for motorcycles or diamond bracelets or suburban status symbols. It was to build a sanctuary where an 8-year-old girl could dance in the sunlight without fear. That weekend, I hosted a small dinner party. It wasn't an obligation. It was a choice. I invited David and his wife and Aunt Sophia. I hired a private chef to prepare a beautiful meal, wanting to celebrate our new life properly. We sat around the large dining table, the city lights of Missoula twinkling through the glass walls. There was no tension. There were no snide remarks. There was only genuine laughter, good wine, and the warmth of chosen family. David raised his glass for a toast. To Arthur, a man who knows how to catch a fraud, protect his assets, and upgrade his life. Cheers. Cheers. We all echoed, the crystal glasses clinking together in a bright, clear sound. I looked across the table at Zoe, who was happily eating a piece of chocolate cake, engaging in a lively conversation with Aunt Sophia about her dance instructor. There was no fear in her posture. She wasn't trying to make herself invisible. She was taking up space exactly as she was meant to. Later that night, after the guests had left and Zoe was fast asleep, I walked through the quiet, pristine apartment. I stopped by my home office. On the bookshelf, tucked away behind a row of heavy accounting textbooks, was the thick manila folder labeled Project Parasite. It was a relic of a past life, a historical document detailing the exact moment I chose myself and my daughter over the toxic obligation of blood. I didn't need to look at it anymore, but I kept it as a reminder that boundaries must be enforced with cold, hard logic, and that peace must be ruthlessly defended. I turned off the office light and walked away. It has been exactly 1 year since the night of the dinner party. The seasons have cycled through, and the bitter Missoula winter has returned, dusting the mountains in white snow. But the cold no longer reaches me. Inside the penthouse, the heat is perfect, the air is calm, and the silence is beautiful. I am standing on the balcony, holding a mug of black coffee, watching the morning traffic move through the streets below. A lot has changed in 12 months. Patricia is currently serving her 2nd year in federal prison. I received a notification from the victim notification system last month stating she had been denied early parole due to poor behavior in the facility. Apparently, her narcissistic need to control everyone around her didn't translate well to the prison hierarchy. Robert is living in a subsidized apartment complex. I don't know what happened to Caleb, and I don't care. They are ghosts. They exist in a parallel universe that no longer intersects with my own. I took another sip of my coffee. In my profession, we are taught to look at the bottom line. We calculate assets, liabilities, and net worth. For 35 years, I had miscalculated my own net worth, tying it to the approval of people who saw me as nothing more than a resource to be mined. I had thought that by being the good son, the provider, the savior, I was buying their love. But love is not a transaction, and you cannot negotiate with a parasite. You can only cut it off. The most valuable skill I possess isn't my ability to read a balance sheet or trace a hidden SWIFT transfer. My most valuable skill was the ability to look at my own mother, see a thief, and have the cold, calculated discipline to hand her over to the law without shedding a single tear. That discipline saved my life. It saved Zoe's life. I heard the soft padding of footsteps behind me. I turned around to see Zoe walking into the living room, rubbing her eyes. She was wearing her favorite oversized pajamas. She walked straight to the glass door, opening it and stepping out onto the cold balcony to stand next to me. "Morning, Dad," she said, leaning against my side. "Morning, sweetie," I replied, wrapping one arm around her shoulders to keep her warm. "Did you sleep well?" "I did," she smiled, looking out at the city. "Are you working today?" "No," I said, kissing the top of her head. "Today the bank is closed. Today is just for us. What do you want to do?" She thought about it for a second. "Can we go get pancakes? The place with the extra syrup." "We can get all the syrup you want," I laughed. We stood there for a moment longer, watching the sun crest over the snow-capped mountains, flooding the city with golden light. I felt the solid reality of the life I had built beneath my feet. I had audited my existence, eliminated the fraud, and secured the future. The ledger was perfectly balanced. And for the first time in my life, I was absolutely, unconditionally free.